Random House Audio presents 3001, The Final Odyssey, by Arthur C. Clarke. Read for you by Scott Brick. For Shireen, Tamara, and Melinda, may you be happy in a far better century than mine. Prologue. The Firstborn. Call them the Firstborn. Though they were not remotely human, they were flesh and blood, and when they looked out across the deeps of space, they felt awe and wonder and loneliness. As soon as they possessed the power, they began to seek for fellowship among the stars. In their explorations, they encountered life in many forms, and watched the workings of evolution on 1,000 worlds. They saw how often the first faint sparks of intelligence flickered and died in the cosmic night. And because, in all the galaxy, they had found nothing more precious than mind, they encouraged its dawning everywhere. They became farmers in the fields of stars. They sowed, and sometimes they reaped. And sometimes, dispassionately, they had to weed. The great dinosaurs had long since passed away, their morning promise annihilated by a random hammer blow from space, when the survey ship entered the solar system after a voyage that had already lasted 1,000 years. It swept past the frozen outer planets, paused briefly above the deserts of dying Mars, and presently looked down on Earth. Spread out beneath them, the explorers saw a world swarming with life. For years they studied, collected, catalogued. When they had learned all that they could, they began to modify. They tinkered with the destiny of many species, on land and in the seas. But which of their experiments would bear fruit, they could not know for at least 1,000,000 years. They were patient, but they were not yet immortal. There was so much to do in this universe of 100 billion suns, and other worlds were calling. So they set out once more into the abyss, knowing that they would never come this way again. Nor was there any need. The servants they had left behind would do the rest. On Earth, the glaciers came and went, while above them the changeless moon still carried its secret from the stars. With a yet slower rhythm than the polar ice, the tides of civilization ebbed and flowed across the galaxy. Strange and beautiful and terrible empires rose and fell and passed on their knowledge to their successors. And now, out among the stars, evolution was driving toward new goals. The first explorers of Earth had long since come to the limits of flesh and blood. As soon as their machines were better than their bodies, it was time to move. First their brains, and then their thoughts alone they transferred into shining new homes of metal and gemstone. In these they roamed the galaxy. They no longer built spaceships. They were spaceships. But the age of the machine entities swiftly passed. In their ceaseless experimenting, they had learned to store knowledge in the structure of space itself, and to preserve their thoughts for eternity in frozen lattices of light. Into pure energy, therefore, they presently transformed themselves, and on 1,000 worlds, the empty shells they had discarded twitched for a while in a mindless dance of death, then crumbled into dust. Now they were lords of the galaxy, and could rove at will among the stars, or sink like a subtle mist through the very interstices of space. Though they were freed at last from the tyranny of matter, they had not wholly forgotten their origin in the warm slime of a vanished sea, and their marvelous instruments still continued to function, watching over the experiments started so many ages ago. But no longer were they always obedient to the mandates of their creators. Like all material things, they were not immune to the corruptions of time and its patient, unsleeping servant, entropy. And sometimes they discovered and sought goals of their own. Part 1. Star City. Chapter 1. Comet Cowboy. Captain Dimitri Chandler, M2973.04.21/93.106/Mars/SpaceAcad 3005, or DIM to his very best friends, was understandably annoyed. The message from Earth had taken 6 hours to reach the space tug Goliath, here beyond the orbit of Neptune. If it had arrived 10 minutes later, he could have answered, "Sorry, can't leave now. We've just started to deploy the sunscreen." The excuse would have been perfectly valid. Wrapping a comet's core in a sheet of reflective film only a few molecules thick but kilometers on a side was not the sort of job you could abandon while it was half completed. Still, it would be a good idea to obey this ridiculous request. He was already in disfavor sunward, through no fault of his own. Collecting ice from the rings of Saturn and nudging it toward Venus and Mercury, where it was really needed, had started back in the 2700s, 3 centuries ago. Captain Chandler had never been able to see any real difference in the before and after images the solar conservers were always producing to support their accusations of celestial vandalism. But the general public, still sensitive to the ecological disasters of previous centuries, had thought otherwise, and the hands-off Saturn vote had passed by a substantial majority. As a result, Chandler was no longer a ring rustler, but a comet cowboy. So here he was at an appreciable fraction of the distance to Alpha Centauri, rounding up stragglers from the Kuiper Belt. There was certainly enough ice out here to cover Mercury and Venus with oceans kilometers deep, but it might take centuries to extinguish their hellfires and make them suitable for life. The solar conservers, of course, were still protesting against this, though no longer with so much enthusiasm. The millions dead from the tsunami caused by the Pacific asteroid in 2304, how ironic that a land impact would have done much less damage, had reminded all future generations that the human race had too many eggs in one fragile basket. Well, Chandler told himself, it would be 50 years before this particular package reached its destination, so a delay of a week would hardly make much difference. But all the calculations about rotation, center of mass, and thrust vectors would have to be redone and radioed back to Mars for checking. It was a good idea to do your sums carefully before nudging billions of tons of ice along an orbit that might take it within hailing distance of Earth. As they had done so many times before, Captain Chandler's eyes strayed toward the ancient photograph above his desk. It showed a 3-masted steamship, dwarfed by the iceberg that was looming above it, as indeed Goliath was dwarfed at this very moment. How incredible, he had often thought, that only one long lifetime spanned the gulf between this primitive discovery and the ship that had carried the same name to Jupiter. And what would those long-ago Antarctic explorers have made of the view from his bridge? They would certainly have been disoriented, for the wall of ice beside which Goliath was floating stretched both upward and downward as far as the eye could see. And it was strange-looking ice, wholly lacking the immaculate whites and blues of the frozen polar seas. In fact, it looked dirty, as indeed it was. For only some 90% was water ice. The rest was a witch's brew of carbon and sulfur compounds, most of them stable only at temperatures not far above absolute zero. Thawing them out could produce unpleasant surprises. As one astrochemist had famously remarked, comets have bad breath. "Skipper to all personnel," Chandler announced. "There's been a slight change of program. We've been asked to delay operations to investigate a target that SpaceGuard radar has picked up." "Any details?" somebody asked, when the chorus of groans over the ship's intercom had died away. "Not many, but I gather it's another Millennium Committee project they've forgotten to cancel." More groans. Everyone had become heartily sick of all the events planned to celebrate the end of the 2000s. There had been a general sigh of relief when January 1st, 3001 had passed uneventfully, and the human race could resume its normal activities. Anyway, it will probably...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?